Hello everyone, it's Tuesday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Boo-kyung. Ever since the Hamas militants stormed Israeli towns on October 7th, tension in the Middle East has been growing, with the Israeli Prime Minister even saying that there will be no ceasefire and that it is a time for war. Amid such tensions, there has been intense scrutiny of North Korea's linkage to militant non-state actors in the region, especially Hamas. North Korean weaponry was being seen and used by Hamas, and its so-called unconventional tactics too have been showing similarities to what North Korea has been using. How does an expert see the linkage between the two? And is there any possibility that Pyongyang would use such tactics against North Korea? For more on this, we have invited a very special guest, Bennett, Senior Defense Analyst at Rand Corporation. Welcome to the show, Dr. Bennett.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us, Dr. Bennett. Now, first question to you. 38 North pointed out the long history of North Korea supplying arms to militant non-state actors, especially Hamas. Could you tell us more about this partnership?
Well, we don't know all the details, obviously. That's very, very much kept secret by them. But we know there's been participation. Look, the North Koreans will sell weapons to just about anybody. That was one of the ways they make hard currency. They also send their soldiers overseas to help train other groups because that gives problems to the United States. And so that's very positive as far as they're concerned. But having said that, they also learn how their weapons work. You know, you can have all kinds of experiments with weapons to destroy buildings or whatever, but to see how they interact with people and what happens, that's the laboratory that North Korea tries to take advantage of.
Right, I see. Well, Dr. Bennett, the evidence of such a long partnership and such providing of North Korea's weapons has been seen in the current Israel-Hamas war as well, as a number of North Korean weapons were seen among munitions seized by Hamas. Could you tell us what they were?
Well, we know some of the weapons, certainly. The most significant one that we see regularly referred to is what's called a rocket-propelled grenade. It's essentially a standoff weapon that allows you to fire an explosive into a crowd of people, against an armored vehicle, whatever. And that's very clearly seems to be a North Korean weapon that they're using. But we've also found artillery with North Korean markings on it. They've seen other weapon systems that seem to have come from North Korea. So this is a pattern of fairly extensive support. Even the gliders that were used by the Hamas personnel to go into Israel could well have come from North Korea, or at least the training has. So there's an extensive support that's going on.
All right, I see. Now, though it is remaining quite cautious until now, Iran warned Israel, saying that it had crossed over the red lines and such an action may force everyone to act. If the war becomes extended, could North Korea in any way take part in?
Well, North Korean personnel probably haven't left Gaza. They're still probably there. So will they participate? Yes. Will they participate as observers and as advisors? Almost certainly. They are probably doing that right now. But will they become very heavily involved? Will they send more troops beyond just advisors? Probably not. Look, North Korea knows that Israel is very determined about attacking those that attack Israel. And the last thing Kim Jong-un wants to do is to put his own life at risk. The Israelis might be persistent enough to put him in jeopardy. And so I think he's going to be careful about that.
How about in terms of providing more weapons?
I think it's quite possible that they will provide more weapons. Certainly resupplied. I mean, look, the Hamas have been using lots of weapons against Israel, especially rockets. They're going to run out of supplies, and they're going to need them resupplied. And we know for years that North Korea has been sending large amounts. There were 35 tons intercepted in 2009 going to Hamas. So we're not just talking about a couple launchers. We're talking about huge quantities. and they probably need to be resupplied.
Right. So there is a high possibility that North Korea might supply the Hamas with more weapons. I see. Yes. Well, Dr. Bennett, when Hamas infiltrated Israel, it did so in a surprise dawn attack, overwhelming Israel's Iron Dome with a barrage of rockets and using drones as well. And some say such unconventional methods could have been similar to the North Korea's. What's your view on this?
Well, we have to remember that however many launchers Hamas has, North Korea has about 7,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers in the forward area. If on average they fire, say, 30 rounds in an hour, which is probably at the low end, that implies we're talking about 200,000 rounds. You know, Hamas was talking about thousands of rounds they fired. North Korea could be talking about hundreds of thousands. So that's a saturation kind of attack that really would have substantial implications. But North Korea is not going to do that unless they really are planning on a major war. They could do something far more limited. There are many targets for South Korea that are in the forward area that they could go after on a more limited basis, hoping to limit the responses that South Korea would make.
So you're saying it is possible that North Korea could use this kind of tactic, but it's not going to use it until if it's not a war, right?
No, if it's not a major war, yeah. I mean, now, could they try to overwhelm a particular facility, a particular military base? Absolutely. But they don't have to fire that much to do that.
Right, I see. Well, one more. The use of paragliders and underground tunnels is also reported to have been transferred from North Korea. What's your view on this?
I think it's entirely possible that they have. I mean, you know, Hamas was looking at ways in which they could infiltrate into Israel. They didn't know for sure that they were going to be able to shut down the electronic systems, the ability of Israel to control the forward area. And so they were looking for ways to insert people otherwise. So the hang gliders, that was something that I'm sure they were looking for someone to help them, and North Korea has been doing that. We can't document that I am aware of that North Korea actually provided those, but I think it's a fairly good likelihood that they would have done that.
Well, this makes me wonder, Dr. Bennett, how have North Korea been using this kind of things? I mean, hang gliders and the underground tunnels.
Well, underground tunnels, of course, have been used by North Korea forever. My first trip to Korea in 1990, I went looking at tunnels with the tunnel neutralization team that existed at that time. Their belief was every North Korean division in the forward area had dug a tunnel. That would be 20-some tunnels under the DMZ. We found 4 that I know of. So that's a very limited number for those that actually exist. This is something that North Korea doesn't just do in the forward area. We're told that North Korea probably has 10,000 or so underground locations where they store weapons and other equipment. So going into North Korea would be a nightmare trying to get it under control. And they've tried to replicate that in other places. They've helped Iran. They've probably been helping Hamas build their tunnels. This is something that they do because if you're out in the open, the U.S. and allied air forces can do a good job at stopping your operations.
Right, I see your point. Well, Dr. Bennett, the reason why we're talking about this is because we have concerns over the possibility of North Korea using similar offensives against South Korea. What are the chances, in your opinion?
Well, I actually just recently wrote an op-ed on this subject. Really? My comment was, if you want to deter someone, you can deter them by making it impossible, or you can deter them by imposing costs on them that they're unwilling to accept. I think South Korea has made it very clear to North Korea that if you do something as extreme as killing 1,000 South Koreans, Kim Jong-un's chance of surviving is not high. South Korea is prepared to respond to that kind of thing. They know that the thing Kim cares about is his own life and control of the country. So there is a clear threat that South Korea has produced. They refer to the Korean massive punishment and retaliation that Korea is prepared to do. That's a very important deterrent to stop the Hamas-style attack. But it only works as long as North Korea doesn't have enough nuclear weapons to neutralize that approach. You know, North Korea appears, from what Kim Jong-un has said, to be shooting for 300 to 500 nuclear weapons. When they even get up to 200 or so, they're going to feel much more comfortable doing conventional attacks because they know that if we retaliate too much, they could go nuclear, and we're going to be very concerned about that. That effect is referred to as a nuclear shadow, and that is a very concerning factor, that we're letting North Korea continue to develop nuclear weapons, and that's very dangerous.
I see. Dr. Bennett, you already mentioned how South Korea is fully prepared for North Korea's such attacks, but South Korea is already re-evaluating its own ability to thwart a similar North Korean offensive. What more could be done, in your opinion?
Well, we also have to step back and say, if North Korea is not going to do something like Hamas did, what other things could they do?
Yeah.
North Korea could infiltrate special forces and go after very vulnerable targets. One of the things that Kim Jong-un learned in 2010 when they sank the Chonan warship and shelled Yeonpyeong Island, their key objective was to split the South Korean populace. Okay? When they shelled Yeonpyeong Island, they didn't do that. The South Korean populace was unified, saying we need to do something about North Korea. But when they sank the Chonan, they did split the populace. So this deniability of an attack is very important, I think, to Kim Jong-un, for now, until he gets that nuclear forces cover. But that's key. I think he thinks that even today he could try to do that. And he's in trouble. He's tried to break our alliance by launching lots of missiles, and instead he's made it stronger. And that's going to be very hard for him to explain to his people. He can't just pull back and say, oh, well, I goofed, sorry, guys. And so what he's likely to do is to escalate. And so we need to be concerned that he could do some kind of conventional attack, but I suspect more likely it's a deniable kind.
All right, I see. Well, Dr. Bennett, shifting gears a little bit here. So due to such worries over North Korea's nuclear and missile threats, there was discussion about strengthening South Korea's defensive posture. And this led to South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and U.S. President Joe Biden's agreement of Washington Declaration. But some say that this is not detailed enough. What's your view?
I tend to agree with that perspective. I mean, if you look at it, we face a very different environment. When we were in the Cold War, we had extensive literature and analysis of what the Soviets could do and how we needed to be prepared to respond to it. This whole nuclear situation for North Korea is a different world. Some of the literature is still right, but some of it's wrong. And so we need to have much more extensive testing, concept development. South Korean people need to know how serious the threat really is. You know, one nuclear weapon going off in Seoul could kill several million people. So this is not a case where we can feel comfortable with North Korea having 50 or more nuclear weapons. As a result, what we need from the Nuclear Consultative Group is much more extensive study and evaluation of the threats, giving us options for responding, helping us to know how to handle them. And the way you do that is with wargaming. You get some group of experts to play North Korea, another group to play US and ROK, and they test out different scenarios and they ask, does this work? Does that work? And then they can give the senior decision makers alternatives so that they're better prepared. And that's one of the steps at this stage that needs to be part of the Washington Declaration. But, you know, we seem to be at a very small scale at this stage. We ought to be doing dozens of games a month And that's not part of what seems to be being done at this stage.
Then you must be very supportive of how South Korea and the U.S. is trying to do more joint exercises, right?
Oh, absolutely. The exercises clearly are frustrating Kim Jong-un. They're clearly telling him, you know, you can launch more missiles, but we're going to do stronger and better exercises. Probably not a good idea. And so he pauses in his missile launches. Now, he could restart, but the exercises are important. I look at a situation and I say, if I were a coach of an all-star soccer team, okay, I wouldn't tell my players, look, the other team doesn't want us to practice because they think we could beat them. So you guys are not allowed to practice. And the problem, of course, is if it's an all-star team, they've never played with each other. They don't know how to work with each other to be effective.
Right.
And so you've got to have them out there training and exercising and working together. And that's one of the key importances of the exercises that we do as military forces.
All right, I see your point. Well, Dr. Bennett, coming back to the Washington Declaration, RAND and the Asan Institute for Policy Studies recently came up with a report entitled Options for Strengthening Republic of Korea's Nuclear Assurance. What were the options?
Well, we actually raised several dozen options, so I'm not going to be able to cover all of them here.
Just a few.
But a few of them, I think the notion of extensive wargaming, concept formulation are key. Helping the South Korean and other people understand the nature of the threat is important. There hasn't been a lot of nuclear training, even in the U.S., in 30 years. And so our military, our national security experts need that. But then we go on to looking at North Korea, the danger we talked about before of once they get enough nuclear weapons, the world becomes safe for conventional warfare. We don't want that. And so what can we do to stop the North Korean development program? Maybe not drive them back to zero. That's probably not possible.
Right.
But at least cause them to pause and not continue building. And I think there are both incentives we could offer, but there are also punishments that we could pose. We have to remember, Kim Jong-un said a couple of years ago, K-pop is a vicious cancer. That is corrupting the morals of his younger generation. And if it continues, it could cause the regime to collapse like a damp wall. So there he was. He identified the very thing we could use as a weapon against him. Outside information, but especially K-pop, something that attracts people. Are we doing that? I don't see it going on. I think we could be far more proactive about sending information in. We know his elites are not entirely happy with what's going on in the North. Even they aren't eating all that well. And so we have the potential to use outside information and to threaten Kim and say, look, if you do this, you know, you do a seventh nuclear test, we are going to send 1 million USB drives into Pyongyang area with K-pop and K-dramas and so forth on them. We know you'll police up a bunch of them, but enough will survive that you're not going to like the outcome.
All right, so you need to be far more proactive. Interesting.
Exactly.
Right. Well, Dr. Bennett, I know that you have already gave us options suggested by both of the institutes, but the discussion over the need for South Korea to deploy itself with the tactical nuclear weapons might not just fade away. And if it is brought up again, what would be your view on such a discussion?
Well, the whole purpose of our report was to say, what can we do so that South Korea doesn't feel forced to produce their own nuclear weapons? Part of our report says, here are the implications of South Korea doing that. Something simple like, if you produce your own nuclear weapons, you need to leave the Non-Proliferation Treaty. If you leave the Non-Proliferation Treaty, you no longer have access to outside uranium. There's a nuclear supplier group, they're not going to give you uranium. What does that do to your nuclear power plants? Not just for weapons. What happens if outside countries decide to impose sanctions on South Korea because it's gone nuclear? So there's lots of dangers associated with South Korea going nuclear. The key in our minds is we have to provide, the U.S. has to work with South Korea to provide the people's assurance. Now, back in the 1960s, when the U.S. was trying to assure our NATO allies, we were worried that Germany in particular might go nuclear, and that could cause a real fissure in NATO. And so we told the European countries, we are going to dedicate a significant number of nuclear weapons to supporting NATO. We dedicated all of our initial ballistic missile submarines to support NATO. Even today, we still maintain 400 warheads on ballistic missile submarines to support NATO. We dedicated at that time bomber warheads to support NATO. So identifying ways that we can support Korea in the same kind of manner is one of the kinds of things we think is essential so that the Korean people feel like they have some degree of assurance.
All right, I see your point. Now, Dr. Bennett, I'd like to ask you many more questions, but I believe this will be our last one. Right now, South Korea is taking quite a stern posture, defensive posture against North Korea, with the defense minister even saying the need to suspend the September 19th military agreement. What's your take on such a position, and what should the country's diplomatic strategy be to improve the tension on the peninsula?
I remember when the agreement was initially announced, and I was talking with my U.S. colleagues here in Korea, and their reaction was horror.
Really?
Because think about it, if indeed one of the soldiers up in the Panmunjom area, one of the American soldiers, has appendicitis, we can't fly a helicopter up there to evacuate him. So there are things about it, I mean, and that's just a very practical, there's reconnaissance implications and so forth. So there are reasons why that agreement doesn't necessarily provide the environment we want. But are we just going to abandon it? Maybe we should go to North Korea and say, look, you can have that agreement, or you can continue, and you stop producing nuclear weapons, or you can continue producing nuclear weapons and we abandon the agreement. Your choice. We've got to start being creative about how we try to leverage North Korea and get the threat under control.
I think I've never heard of advice to be creative. It's really interesting.
Well, it is, because all the old ideas people have thought about, talked about, and none of them sound very good.
Right.
Now is time to be creative.
All right. Well, thank you for your advice, Dr. Bennett. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you for coming into the studio and sharing your thoughts. I really appreciate it.
My privilege. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.